My mother-in-law, who lives on a $1,200 a month Social Security check, invited 10 relatives to stay for a month, then boldly announced she would cover all their expenses. I locked her 5 authorized user cards and went back to my parents' house. My husband's family went into a panic and called me 57 times. That afternoon, I was sitting in my parents' home when my phone began to vibrate incessantly. At first, I thought it was a wrong number, but when I picked it up and looked at the screen, I froze for a second. My husband Mark's name flooded the missed call list. Sandwiched between them was a call from my mother-in-law, Brenda. Then a few unknown numbers that I immediately guessed belonged to his relatives. The phone had barely gone silent for 30 seconds before it started ringing again. It went on like this, one call after another, so relentless that I hadn't even set the phone down before it buzzed again. I opened the call log and let out a small laugh. In just over an hour, there were 57 missed calls. 57. I counted them again to be sure. The text messages stretched into a long, scrolling line. Why isn't the card working? Did you lock the cards? Call me back, now. And then came messages from the unknown numbers, blunt and to the point. Is there a problem with the card, niece? I set the phone down on the table and poured another cup of hot tea. In my parents' backyard, the afternoon sun was warm, and the old oak tree by the porch swayed gently in the breeze. The scene was so peaceful that, if I weren't looking at my phone screen, I could hardly imagine the chaos likely unfolding on the other side of the city. This morning, before leaving my house, I had done something very simple. I opened my banking app, went to the credit card management section, and one by one, I locked all 5 authorized user cards linked to my primary account. With just a few taps, in less than a minute, the 5 cards that my husband's family had been using for months were instantly deactivated. Those cards were issued from my account. Initially, they were just for Mark to conveniently buy groceries or pay utility bills and household expenses. But gradually, without me even realizing when it happened, they had become the shared property of his entire family. My mother-in-law, Brenda, had even handed them to relatives to go shopping. One time, I saw a payment notification from an upscale restaurant. Another time, it was a huge bill from a high-end grocery store. When I asked her about it, she just waved it off with a laugh. We're all family, she'd say. What's there to keep track of? Over time, that phrase became an excuse for everyone to spend my money without a shred of guilt. I picked up my teacup, took a sip, and glanced at my phone again. It was ringing. This time, it was Brenda. I watched it for a few seconds, then silenced it. The truth is, this didn't just start this morning. 3 days ago, I came home from work to find the front door wide open. The noise inside sounded like a rowdy family reunion. I assumed it was just a few guests, but as soon as I stepped inside, I stopped in my tracks. The living room was packed with people. A man was hauling a large suitcase onto the floor. A young cousin was wrestling with several overstuffed bags, and someone else was even carrying a rolled-up comforter and pillow. In total, nearly a dozen people were standing and sitting all over the house, laughing and talking as if they owned the place. Seeing me, my mother-in-law beamed and introduced them. These are some cousins from back home who've come for a visit. A middle-aged man stood up to shake my hand, smiling casually. It's gotten real hard to find work back in our town, so we thought we'd come to the city to try our luck. A young woman sitting nearby added, "This is so convenient, having a place to stay right near all the big companies." I stood there for a moment before it dawned on me. They weren't just visiting, they were planning to stay. Before I could ask any more questions, Brenda clapped a relative on the shoulder and said confidently, "Don't you all worry. This house is big enough for everyone. We're all family, and you don't have to think about money." She said it in front of everyone, her voice firm, as if the decision had been made long ago. I turned to look at my husband. Mark was standing by the kitchen doorway, offering only a weak smile before turning away. He didn't say a single word. Dinner that evening made everything even clearer. As we ate, they started discussing where to apply for jobs, which industrial parks were hiring, and which companies paid well. One of them said bluntly, "We'll save so much money not having to pay for rent." Another man laughed loudly. Coming to the city from a small town and landing a place like this is a dream come true. I sat there, a lump forming in my throat. In their minds, my house had seemingly transformed into a free boarding house in the middle of a major city. The phone on the table vibrated again, pulling me back to the present. The screen still showed my husband's name. I looked at it for a moment, then shook my head. By now, his family had probably discovered something they had never considered. The 5 authorized user cards they had grown so accustomed to using had, since this morning, stopped working. I took another sip of tea, set the cup down, and let out a slow breath. This time, I really wanted to see how they would manage when my money was no longer available to them. 3 days earlier, around midday, while I was still at the office, my mother-in-law had called, urging me to come home early. Her voice was unusually cheerful, as if something big was happening. She said, "Can you try to leave work a little early today? We have family visiting from out of town." I was busy, so I just gave a non-committal reply that I would if I finished my work. In my head, I figured it was just a few relatives stopping by for a couple of days, a meal, and then they'd be on their way. My husband's family often had people passing through, so I didn't think much of it. But just before the end of the workday, Mark sent me a very short text. "Pick up some extra food on your way home. We have a lot of people." Just those few words felt strange. "How many is a lot?" I called him back to ask, but he was evasive. "Oh, just a few uncles and cousins from back home. Just grab some more meat, vegetables, and some soda." His vague tone annoyed me, but I still stopped by the grocery store. I figured 5 or 6 people at most, but when I got home and opened the gate, I could hear the sound of laughter and conversation carrying from the living room all the way out to the driveway. For a second, I thought I was at the wrong house. Stepping inside, I froze in the doorway. The living room was crammed with people. Shoes were scattered from the porch all the way into the house. Several large suitcases were propped against the wall, and handbags, plastic bags, and blankets were piled next to the sofa. Some people were drinking water, others were on the phone, and one person had even spread a towel over a chair as if they'd been here for a long time. When Brenda saw me, she smiled brightly and rushed to greet me, as if she had been waiting for this exact moment. She pulled me by the hand and launched into a whirlwind of introductions. This was a cousin, that was a cousin's wife, an uncle's nephew, and a young couple who were the children of some distant relative from her hometown. My head was spinning. I couldn't keep track of who was who. I just knew that I wasn't looking at a few casual visitors, but an entire delegation that had arrived from out of town. A tan man in his 50s with a booming voice smiled warmly as soon as he saw me. "Ah, so this is the daughter-in-law. So young and pretty. No wonder Brenda is always bragging about you." I managed a polite, forced smile. Before I could respond, a woman in her 30s cut in. "Ma'am, which industrial parks around here are easy to get a job at? I hear the city is desperate for workers right now." Her question startled me. Before I could answer, the man from before rested a hand on his suitcase and said casually, "It's just too hard to make a living back home anymore. The farms don't pay enough to eat. We all decided to come up here to find work. Anything, to make a steady income." I turned to my mother-in-law. She showed no signs of surprise or embarrassment. On the contrary, she nodded enthusiastically. Yes, coming here was the right move. What is there to rely on back home? If you're willing to work hard here, you'll find a job. Then she clapped a young cousin on the shoulder and laughed. "You all just stay here and get settled. We'll figure out the rest as we go." Her words made my heart sink. Get settled here. What did that mean? A few days or long term? I looked at Mark, waiting for him to clarify things for me, but he just avoided my gaze and bent down to help carry a suitcase inside. His silence in that moment told me everything. This hadn't just happened spontaneously. He had known about it beforehand. I was probably the last one to find out. Lunch that day was a hastily prepared but boisterous affair, like a holiday feast. People were packed around 2 tables, and extra chairs had to be brought in. As soon as I sat down, the conversation revolved around a single topic: jobs. One person asked where to find factory work. Another asked if the pay at the sewing factory was better than back home. A young man, while piling food onto his plate, said, "If we don't have to pay for rent here, we can make it work." But trying to pay for rent and food right after moving here would be tough. A woman next to him immediately agreed. "Exactly. You need a place to land first. It's hard to move to the city and have to rent a place right away." I put my fork down, and each word felt like a direct blow. They were discussing this at my dinner table, right in front of me. With such casualness, it was as if the whole family had already agreed to it. Not a single person turned to ask if I was okay with it. Not one of them felt awkward about discussing their plans to live, eat, and stay for free in the very house that I paid the vast majority of the expenses for. The breaking point came when a young cousin smiled, pointed at the pile of suitcases, and said, half joking, "We brought enough blankets and pillows to last a few months." The whole table burst out laughing. Only I couldn't. I turned to my mother-in-law, hoping she would at least say something to be polite, like they could stay for a little while and then see, or that it depended on the situation. But no, she held her head high and declared with utter confidence, "Just stay here and don't worry. This house has plenty of room, and I'll cover your food and board. You don't need to worry about rent or anything." As soon as she said it, a wave of relief washed over the table. The relatives looked at each other, their faces alight with excitement. One man even raised his glass and laughed. "Having a sister like you is a true blessing." Another person added, "Coming to the city and finding such a good situation, what more could you ask for?" I felt a lump rise in my throat. The good situation they were talking about was my home. The food and board my mother-in-law promised was, in reality, my money. I silently turned to look at Mark again. He was still quiet, his head down, eating as if he hadn't heard a thing. It was in that moment that a strange feeling began to build inside me. It wasn't quite anger, not yet an explosion, but a distinct, chilling coldness. I suddenly understood that from the moment those suitcases were rolled through my door, this house would no longer be a peaceful home, and if I continued to stay silent, it wouldn't be long before I became the one supporting an entire group of strangers disguised as family in my own house. After just one day, the once peaceful house had been completely transformed. I would leave for work in the morning and return in the afternoon to the sound of chatter echoing out the front door. The living room door would be ajar, fans blasting at full speed, the TV blaring, and the sound of slippers shuffling across the tile floor was enough to give me a headache. Stepping inside felt like entering a crowded dormitory, not my own home. The living room was in disarray. The sofa set had been pushed to one side to make room for several mattresses on the floor. The corner that had been tidy yesterday was now piled high with suitcases, bags of clothes, and even a few cases of instant ramen someone had brought from their hometown. Towels, jackets, and plastic bags hung from the armrests of the chairs. Someone had even brazenly draped a freshly washed shirt over the back of a chair to dry. I stood there for a moment, a chill running through me. My house had never been this messy. Seeing me, a young cousin poked her head out from the kitchen and smiled casually. "Oh, you're back from work? We're borrowing the living room to sleep. It was too crowded last night." Her nonchalant tone left me speechless. Before I could say anything, another man chimed in. "For a city house, this is pretty spacious. A little crowding isn't a big deal." They spoke to each other, and to me, as if all of this was normal, obvious, something I was expected to accept. The kitchen was no longer my familiar kitchen. Early in the morning, someone was already rummaging through the refrigerator for food. By noon, pots, pans, and dishes covered every inch of the counter. When I came home in the evening, I'd find the rice cooker on, a half-cooked pot of soup on the stove, and chopped vegetables scattered on the cutting board. The stove was being used multiple times a day because some people came back early from job hunting, others left late, and those who stayed home to watch the belongings ate separately. One day, I had just finished washing a sink full of dishes, and when I turned around, Another half-sinkful had appeared. The feeling was exhausting, but what made it worse was that no one seemed to feel the least bit awkward. Everyone acted as if it was perfectly natural for me to come home from a full day of work and immediately start spinning like a top in the kitchen. The younger ones would have a quick breakfast and then head out to look for jobs. One would ask for directions to an industrial park, another would ask about bus routes, and yet another would ask Mark for a ride to drop off applications. But there were also those who would leave for a short while and then return early, propping their feet up in front of the TV, switching from music videos to soccer games. Some would just lie on the mattresses in the living room, phone in hand, munching on snacks, looking as relaxed as if they were in their own home. In the evenings after dinner, they would gather in groups, talking late into the night. They told stories from back home, discussed job prospects, and roared with laughter over pointless jokes. I would lie in my bedroom and still hear their murmuring voices outside, a dull ache forming in my head, making it impossible to sleep. What bothered me most was how quickly they adapted to a lifestyle of depending on my home. Once, I was in the kitchen getting a glass of water when I overheard two of them talking right outside the door. One man chuckled. "It's pretty great coming here. Even if you haven't found a job yet, you're saving on rent." The other replied matter-of-factly, "Not just rent, food too. Brenda said we can stay as long as we want." They laughed cheerfully after that, as if they had just struck a great bargain. I stood in the kitchen, the water pitcher still in my hand, a chill running down my spine. They said it right in front of me, without lowering their voices, without any sense of shame. In their eyes, this house was simply a temporary foothold in the city, and I was the one who was implicitly expected to absorb all those savings. My mother-in-law became even more outrageous. Not only did she not remind her relatives to be considerate, but she actively took charge like a generous landlady. That morning, I was getting dressed in my room when I heard her voice from the living room. "Whoever is going to the store, take this card. Buy whatever we're missing." I stepped out to see her handing one of my authorized user credit cards to a young cousin in his early 20s. He took it naturally, even grinning. "Okay, I'll get some more milk and fruit." I stopped and asked, my voice soft but clear, "Mom, what card is that?" Brenda turned to me, her expression nonchalant. "It's the household card. What else would it be? With this many people, if we don't buy more, what will everyone eat?" I didn't say anything more, but a heavy feeling settled in my gut. That afternoon, my phone alerted me to a charge at the grocery store. Less than an hour later, another charge from a convenience store. In the evening, a bill from a fast food restaurant. The next morning, a charge for bottled water, then snacks, then a few other miscellaneous items. Every time my phone lit up with a notification of a deduction from my account, my heart sank a little further. It wasn't that I was stingy about a few dollars for household food. What made me feel choked up was the way they spent my money, as if it were a shared fund, a common resource that anyone had the right to use. Once, I saw the cousin return from the store. In addition to bags of meat and vegetables, he was carrying several expensive energy drinks and a pile of junk food. I asked, "Why did you buy so much?" He just smiled innocently. "Everything is so convenient in the city. I just grabbed it. It's not like it's any trouble for you when I use the card." His words left me stunned for a few seconds. "It's not like it's any trouble for you." To him, swiping my card was as easy as a flick of the wrist. And to my mother-in-law, it was even less of a big deal. She overheard and just waved it away. Young people buy what they like. It's just a few dollars. I turned to Mark, waiting for my husband to say something. But he stuck to his usual script, silence, or at most, a perfunctory comment. "Come on, Sarah. They're family." I was so tired of hearing that phrase. Family. When my money needed to be spent, everyone was family. But when it came to being considerate, showing respect, or acknowledging my boundaries, no one seemed to remember that I was part of the family too. In those days, what exhausted me wasn't just the messy house, the rising expenses, or the chaotic living situation. What chilled me to the bone was that in that entire house, From my mother-in-law and husband to the crowd of relatives living off of us, not a single person truly believed they were doing anything wrong. In their eyes, since I had money, I was obligated to provide. My house was big, so they were entitled to stay. My card could be swiped, so it was there to be used. My feelings, my exhaustion, my boundaries, none of it seemed worthy of anyone's consideration. It was then that I began to understand something very clearly. If I stayed silent, they would only push further. That afternoon, as I was sitting at my desk at work, my phone buzzed with a notification of a transaction. I glanced at the screen out of habit, assuming it was another charge from the grocery store or supermarket like the past few days. But when I saw the amount, my hand froze. The charge was significantly larger than usual, not a few dozen or $100 for typical household expenses, but a sum that would make anyone frown if they saw it unexpectedly withdrawn from their account. I immediately opened my banking app to check. The transaction details clearly showed the store name and purchase category. It wasn't the supermarket or the convenience store near our house. It was a major department store at the mall. I clicked for more details, a cold feeling spreading through me. The list of items appeared. New clothes, shoes, cosmetics, a handbag, and even a few small but not inexpensive electronics. Just a quick scan was enough for me to know that whoever had swiped the card wasn't buying groceries for the house. They were on a personal shopping spree. I sat still for a few seconds, my eyes glued to the screen. The face of the young female cousin who often carried my authorized user card as if it were her own immediately came to mind. That morning, before I left for work, I had seen her dressed in clean loungewear, her hair tied up, a hint of lipstick on, telling my mother-in-law with a smile that she was going out to check out some job openings. I hadn't said anything at the time, never imagining her version of checking out would include a shopping trip that cost a significant amount of money. For the rest of the afternoon, I could barely concentrate on my work. Most people would have called immediately, would have made a scene, but I didn't want to handle things while I was still angry. I just turned off my phone screen, tried to finish my work, and left the office earlier than usual. The drive home was heavy. It wasn't about the money itself, but the feeling of being disrespected, of being treated like a bottomless wallet, was what I couldn't stomach. When I got home and stepped onto the driveway, I could already hear laughter from the living room. The atmosphere inside was as noisy as ever. The smell of snacks, new perfume, and cooking from the kitchen mingled into a suffocating odor. I put my purse down on a chair, and before I could even take off my shoes, I saw her, the young cousin, sitting in the middle of the living room. On the coffee table in front of her were several glossy shopping bags from the department store, tags still on. A new pair of shoes sat neatly under the chair, and a handbag, still partially wrapped in tissue paper, was being passed around by the others. One person complimented the shirt, another praised the shade of lipstick. I watched the scene, and a chill settled deep within me. I didn't even need to ask. I knew exactly where the money from that afternoon had gone. I walked closer, trying to keep my voice calm. Who used the card to go shopping today? The cousin looked up at me, hesitating for a split second before smiling casually. She held up the shirt in her hand, smoothing the sleeve. My cousin and I just went out to look around a bit. Everything in the city is so expensive, ma'am. We only bought a few things and the total shot up. Her words left me speechless for a moment. Not because I didn't understand the word expensive, but because she said it as if using my card for her personal shopping was the most normal thing in the world. It was just that the city was so pricey that she accidentally spent more than she planned. Her nonchalant tone, her guilt-free smile, it made my throat tighten. I turned to my mother-in-law, hoping she would see how out of line this was, but no. Brenda walked out of the kitchen, a ladle still in her hand, and her face lit up when she saw the shopping bags. Did you get anything nice? When you're in the city, you have to dress the part. I tried to keep my voice even. Mom, I just want to say that if you're going to use the card for personal items, especially for a large amount like this, you should at least give me a heads up. It's very hard to keep track of spending like this. I thought I had been clear enough, polite enough. I hadn't yelled, been sarcastic, or embarrassed anyone. But as soon as I finished, Brenda's face darkened. She slammed the ladle down on the table, her voice rising noticeably. Hard to keep track of what? We're all family. What's there to count? I took a deep breath, still trying to explain. It's not about counting, but finances need to be clear. Household expenses are one thing, but personal shopping is another. It should be discussed beforehand. If you just swipe it like that, I'll have no idea where the money is going. Brenda let out a short, dismissive laugh and turned to the other relatives as if to make her case. See, everyone? She's getting stingy over a few dollars. I was just buying the girls a new outfit for their job interviews, not burning money. As soon as she said that, a few people around the table started to chuckle in agreement. Some forced a smile, others laughed outright. An older woman, probably Brenda's cousin, shook her head and said, "Oh, please. Back home, we help each other out with much more than this. Getting upset over a little money just spoils the mood." Another man, shelling sunflower seeds, chimed in, "That's right. It's normal for family to support each other in tough times. You're already giving them a place to stay. So what's the big deal about helping them buy an outfit for a job interview?" I stood in the middle of the living room, listening to every word, feeling my chest tighten. None of them saw this as using someone else's money without permission. In their eyes, the fact that I had an issue with it was what was unacceptable. I suddenly felt like I was the one in the wrong, the petty one in a group of people who were innocently enjoying the generosity they believed they deserved. The most painful part was when I, once again, turned to look at Mark. And, as always, he stood there in silence. He was near the kitchen doorway, holding a glass of water, looking somewhere else as if this had nothing to do with him. I was waiting for just one sentence, something simple like, "Everyone, if you're using my wife's money, you need to ask her first." But nothing came. His silence was chilling. It was in that moment that I finally understood something I had been trying to deceive myself into ignoring. The problem wasn't the clothes, the shoes, or the makeup anymore. The problem was that every single person in this house, from my mother-in-law and the relatives to my own husband, had become accustomed to the idea that my money was something they had a right to use, not as a favor, not as a loan, not even as a request, but as an entitlement. It was as if, because I earned money, it was my duty to provide for them, to carry their burdens, to silently let them spend, and to feel happy that I was doing the right thing. I looked around the room, filled with laughter, new shopping bags, and faces that looked at me as if I were overreacting to something trivial. And for the first time, I no longer felt frustrated. It was a clear, distinct coldness. A coldness so profound that I knew if I continued to endure, to explain, to hope they would understand on their own, the only person who would be cornered in the end would be me. That night, with my mother-in-law's words, stingy over a few dollars, echoing in my head, I couldn't sleep. I lay on my side, my eyes wide open in the dark, staring at the ceiling, listening to every sound from the living room, the footsteps, the shuffle of slippers on the floor, someone's muffled laugh, the bathroom door opening and closing. It was nearly midnight, but the house was still not quiet. Every sound made me feel like the very bed I was lying in was no longer my private space. I turned to my side. Mark was already asleep, his breathing even, as if nothing in the world was worth worrying about. The sight of his back turned to me felt colder than the argument from earlier that day. People say your husband is the person closest to you, the one who should at least understand how tired and hurt you are. Yet, for the past few days, from the moment a crowd of relatives rolled their suitcases into our home to the instant my bank account was being drained without my consent, he had only one response: silence. That silence hurt more than being blamed or yelled at. It was like a confirmation that, in this house, my feelings did not matter. I closed my eyes, but scenes kept flashing through my mind. The suitcases piled up in the living room, the way everyone talked and laughed as if they owned the place. The shopping bags, purchased with my card, displayed proudly on the coffee table. My mother-in-law's nonchalant declaration that she would cover food and board, as if she were the one paying for it all. I thought about every meal, every bill, every transaction notification that had popped up on my phone over the past few days. In such a short time, this house had become a shelter for nearly a dozen people, and I had become the one bearing all the costs without anyone even bothering to ask me. What hurt the most wasn't losing the money. I work, I earn a living. I've never been stingy if the money was used for the right purpose, for the right person, in the right way. But here, no one had asked for my opinion before they all moved in. No one sat me down to explain they were facing hardship and needed a place to stay for a short while. No one politely asked for my help because they were in a tough spot. Everything just happened, as if it were my duty. My house was big, so they came to live in it. I had money, so they spent it. And if I was upset, I was the one being petty. The more I thought about it, the colder I felt. I quietly reached for my phone on the nightstand. The screen lit up the dark room, my face a faint reflection on the glass. I opened my banking app out of habit, but this time, it wasn't to check a specific transaction. I went to the card management section and looked at the list of 5 active authorized user cards. 5 cards. One I had initially gotten for Mark for household shopping. Another my mother-in-law had started using because she claimed she wasn't comfortable with mobile payments. The others, I could hardly remember when or how they ended up in someone else's hands. I only knew that for the past few days, those cards were like 5 open faucets, draining money from my account uncontrollably. I scrolled through the transaction history of the last few days. The spending had escalated so quickly that even I was shocked. Groceries, supermarket runs, takeout, drinks, and then the personal items that people casually bought with my card. In just a few days, the amount had ballooned abnormally. I stared at the numbers for a long time. It was no longer a feeling of annoyance or impulsive anger, but a moment of complete clarity. If I let this continue, it wouldn't stop after a few days. They would stay longer, spend more, and push further. At that point, I wouldn't just lose money. I would lose the last shred of my own boundaries in my own home. I turned off the screen, placed the phone on my chest, and lay still. Outside, the chatter finally began to die down. In the darkness, I asked myself a very clear question. How much longer was I going to put up with this? I had tolerated it when they moved in without asking. I had tolerated it when my kitchen was turned upside down and my house became a free-for-all dormitory. I had tolerated it when my mother-in-law handed my card to someone else. I had even tolerated being called stingy in the middle of my own living room. But what had I gained from all that tolerance? Another new transaction tomorrow? Another relative showing up with a suitcase next week? Until I became a stranger in the very home I had built? I finally drifted off to a short, fitful sleep near dawn. When I woke up, I could already hear murmuring from the living room, the clatter of dishes in the kitchen. Someone was asking where to go for a job interview. The TV was on, far too loud. I sat up, looked around my room for a moment, and then got out of bed. For some reason, my mind felt incredibly clear, free of the heavy weight from the night before. Everything seemed to have fallen into place in my head. I opened the closet and took out a medium-sized suitcase, not too big, but large enough for a few days' worth of essentials. I folded a few outfits, packed some toiletries, my phone charger, and important documents, then zipped it shut. Each movement was neat, unhurried but without hesitation. The noise from outside was still audible, but I paid it no mind. For the first time in days, I felt a strange sense of calm. When you see a problem clearly, the chaos subsides. I rolled the suitcase to the door. The wheels made a soft rumbling sound on the floor, just loud enough for a few people in the living room to look up. Breakfast was still in progress. Plates of food and dishes cluttered the table. A man was picking his teeth, and a young cousin was eating while scrolling on her phone. My mother-in-law sat at the head of the table. When she saw my suitcase, she raised an eyebrow. She didn't ask where I was going or what was wrong. She just let out a small, contemptuous smirk and said, "She'll throw a tantrum for a few days and then come back." I stood there and looked at her for a few seconds. If this had been the me of a few days ago, I might have tried to explain, to argue, to make them understand. but not this morning. I didn't say a word. I calmly placed my suitcase by the door, took out my phone, and opened the same banking app I had stared at for so long the night before. The card management screen appeared. 5 authorized user cards were listed right in front of me. I touched my finger to each one. Lock card 1, lock card 2, 3, 4, 5. It all happened in a matter of seconds, swift and cold. A confirmation message popped up on the screen. I saw it clearly, then turned off the phone. Then, I picked up the handle of my suitcase and walked straight out the door. Behind me, I could still hear the soft clink of dishes, the shifting of a chair, and a brief, stunned silence from the people sitting there. I didn't look back. That morning, I left that house without needing to say another word. Because, for the first time, I understood that some battles aren't meant to be won through argument. Sometimes, all you have to do is stop, and others will finally learn what it feels like to lose something they once took for granted. It wasn't long after I arrived at my parents' house that the chaos truly began at my in-laws. I wasn't there, but just by looking at the flood of calls on my phone and piecing together what I knew about each person in that house, I could vividly imagine the pandemonium that had erupted. After I left, probably no one noticed anything unusual at first. In my mother-in-law's eyes, I was just having another childish tantrum, as she always assumed. She likely sat back down at the table, tilted her head, and told the relatives to eat up, that I'd be back soon enough. None of them probably cared either. My presence or absence was less important than the fact that there was still food in the house, a roof over their heads, and, most importantly, the credit cards they had grown used to carrying as if they were their own. But a few hours later, that false sense of security began to crack. A young cousin was sent by my mother-in-law to the supermarket to buy more food and other supplies for the house. He pushed a cart around, filling it with meat, fish, vegetables, milk, snacks, and even some sodas and junk food. At the checkout, he pulled out the authorized user card and swiped it, just like he had done before. The machine beeped error. He looked up, thinking the cashier had made a mistake or the machine was malfunctioning, and told her to try again. Still no luck. On the third try, the cashier looked at him and said clearly, "Sir, this card is not working." That's when he started to panic and called my mother-in-law. I could almost hear his reedy voice from the voicemail he left. "Aunt Brenda, the card won't go through. There's a line of people waiting behind me." At first, my mother-in-law was probably still overconfident. She would have frowned and told him to try again, that it was probably just a machine error. I knew that arrogant tone all too well. She always thought she had everything under control, as long as no one dared to contradict her. But trying again was useless. Less than 20 minutes later, her phone started ringing off the hook. Someone at a convenience store called because they couldn't pay for their drinks. Another had just ordered takeout and was left red-faced when the card was declined. Someone else was even sitting at a coffee shop near a potential job, only to discover at the register that the familiar card was now just a useless piece of plastic. Each person called with a new complaint, some angry, some surprised, some humiliated from being stuck at the checkout counter. The overlapping chorus of voices must have made the already noisy house even more chaotic. It was then that someone in the house finally blurted out the obvious conclusion. "There's something wrong with this card. It's been locked." With just that one sentence, I'm sure the atmosphere shifted dramatically. Carefree confidence turned into anxious restlessness. The belief that it was a simple machine error gave way to suspicious glances, wild guesses, and the dawning realization that this was not a simple problem. My mother-in-law must have been the one to truly panic then, because she knew better than anyone else. Those cards were not hers. Yet, she had used them to prop up her image in front of her relatives, to promise them free room and board, when in reality, none of it was ever her money. Once I locked the cards, the facade she had so carefully constructed immediately crumbled. She called me for the first time. I watched the screen, let it ring until it stopped, and then silenced it. She called a second time, then a third. Then Mark called, followed by the unknown numbers again. I didn't answer. It wasn't because I didn't know what they wanted. I knew all too well. It was just that, for the first time, I wanted them to experience the feeling of losing something they had taken for granted as their own. Back at the house, whispers must have started. One person would look at another, then glance at my mother-in-law. Someone would have said, just loud enough for the room to hear, "Looks like the daughter-in-law is really mad this time." Another might have sighed, "This is not going to end well." To an outsider, those words might seem harmless, but to my mother-in-law, they were like needles pricking at her pride. She loved to maintain her image, to appear as someone with influence, with money, with the ability to care for her extended family. Now, right in front of the very people she had boasted to, everything was spiraling out of her control. But Brenda probably wouldn't have given up her composure just yet. I can imagine her tone half sharp, half strained. "She's just throwing a fit. I'll call her again later, and it'll be fine. What's there to panic about?" The more she tried to sound tough, the more flustered she likely was inside, because only someone who knows what they're truly relying on understands how gaping the ground beneath them becomes when that support is pulled away. Then came lunchtime. Maybe someone in the house tried to order food for the large group, or perhaps my mother-in-law sent someone to buy more groceries, as had become the new routine. Whatever the case, the result was the same. The card didn't work. And as for cash, there wasn't much of it. Even if her entire $1,200 Social Security check was untouched, it was nowhere near enough to feed a swarm of adults in a major city. It was at that precise moment, I believe, that my mother-in-law was forced to confront the one truth she had refused to acknowledge. Not a single dollar in the house was usable anymore. Not because the house was literally out of money, but because the source they had so casually tapped into that morning had been completely cut off by me. And from that second on, the house they had viewed as a free haven began to show its true colors, a place where, once the money stopped, all semblance of peace instantly devolved into chaos. That afternoon, after the series of declined cards at the supermarket, the convenience store, and the restaurant, the atmosphere in my husband's house shifted entirely. If just a few days ago the house had been filled with the constant buzz of laughter and chatter, with people coming and going like a festival, by that afternoon, that manufactured cheerfulness had vanished. It was the same group of people, sitting in the same living room, but everyone's face was visibly grim. Some leaned back against the sofa, others stood with hands on their hips in the middle of the room, and some just scrolled aimlessly on their phones before sighing. No one was talking about job hunting with any enthusiasm anymore. No one was laughing about how lucky they were to be in the city. It was as if they had all been yanked out of a comfortable dream they thought would last. The first person to speak up was an older uncle who had come from their hometown with the group. His voice, normally booming, was sharp and grating when he was annoyed. He leaned forward, his hands on his knees, and looked directly at my mother-in-law, not bothering to beat around the bush. "You said you would cover our room and board here. So what's this about the cards not working?" The question echoed in the crowded living room, silencing everyone for a beat. It wasn't a casual inquiry anymore. It was an accusation. The image my mother-in-law had so carefully maintained since her relatives arrived began to crack, punctured by her own family. Before she could answer, a woman sitting nearby interjected impatiently. "So how are we supposed to eat? I didn't even dare order anything for lunch because I was afraid we couldn't pay." A younger man's voice grew sharp. "I just got back from a job interview with only a few bucks in my pocket. If we can't pay for anything here, how are we supposed to get by?" One by one, the complaints started piling on my mother-in-law. The warm, polite facade from the first day was gone. No one remembered the phrase "we're all family" that she had so often used. When it came down to money, down to their next meal, everyone's true colors showed with chilling speed. My mother-in-law must have been truly flustered by then. She was still sitting at the head of the table, but the head held high, confident demeanor of the past few days had disappeared. I imagine she tried to maintain her composure, to keep her voice firm. She probably locked it temporarily. Let me call her again. But the uncertainty in her voice surely betrayed her. After all, her Social Security check was only $1,200 a month. For her alone, living frugally, it might have been enough. But to support nearly a dozen adults, with 3 meals a day, utilities, and transportation in a major city, she couldn't afford it, not even if she sold all of her pride. I can picture her pacing back and forth in the living room, phone in hand, her face etched with worry. Maybe she opened her wallet, counting and recounting the few bills inside. Maybe she rummaged through drawers, looking for any spare cash hidden away. But the more she looked, the more she had to face a hard truth. She had grown so used to being generous with my money that now, when she had to pay for things herself, she had almost nothing to back it up. Unable to withstand the pressure, she finally called Mark. Her voice was likely a mix of urgency and anger. "Mark, call your wife. Tell her to unlock the cards. The house is in an uproar." The way she spoke made it sound as though I were the one causing trouble, as if locking my own credit cards was the most unreasonable act in the world. In her mind, I had a responsibility to turn them back on so everyone could continue spending, so the house could return to the false harmony of the past few days. Mark probably started to panic then. He had rarely been involved in the household finances. If we needed something, I took care of it. If there was a problem, I solved it. If his mother needed anything, she turned to me. So when that source was suddenly cut off, he finally realized how helpless he was. He called me again and again, from his number, then his mother's, then the relatives' unknown numbers. My phone kept ringing, but I ignored it. I saw every call. It was just that, this time, I refused to rush in and clean up the mess created by their audacity. Back at the house, the more they failed to reach me, the more suffocating the atmosphere became. A few relatives started huddling together, whispering, but in a crowded room, their whispers were audible to everyone. One man sighed. "If there's no money for expenses, staying here is no different than being trapped." Another replied, "Exactly. We just got to the city. If we don't have money for food and transportation, we can't get anywhere." A young woman holding a child in the corner of the sofa was even more direct. "I thought coming here meant we'd have a place to land on our feet. But now, what are we supposed to do?" That phrase, "being trapped," was perfect because it exposed the true nature of their visit. They hadn't come for a family reunion or to offer support. They came because they wanted to latch onto my home as a free pit stop in the city. A place to sleep, someone to cook for them, a card to swipe, and someone to carry the financial burdens they should have shouldered themselves. When that support was removed, they immediately felt trapped. And when people feel trapped, they stop being polite. They start calculating, complaining, and turning on the pursuer who made them promises. And so, the group that had cheerfully rolled their suitcases into the city, filled with hope for a new beginning, started looking at each other with resentment. They looked at my mother-in-law with suspicion. They looked at the house as a place no longer worth staying in if there was no money to fuel it. That resentment spread quickly, from the living room to the kitchen, from the dining table to the porch. It didn't explode into a full-blown argument right away, but it thickened in every glance, every sigh, every frustrated, unfinished sentence. And perhaps it was from that afternoon on that my mother-in-law began to see clearly. The relatives she had so eagerly welcomed, the ones she had promised to support, felt no real loyalty or gratitude toward her. They were happy, only as long as they benefited. When the benefits disappeared, all that was left was resentment and demands. That evening, after letting my phone ring all afternoon, I finally answered when Mark called one more time. I was sitting on the back porch of my parents' house. In front of me was a half-empty cup of cold tea. The sky had darkened, and the only sounds were a distant dog barking and the faint noise of a TV from a neighbor's house. The quiet made the voice on the other end of the line sound even louder, more strained, more urgent. As soon as I picked up, Mark spoke, almost without a greeting. "Why did you lock the cards?" His voice was a tight mix of anger and panic, trying to stay controlled but failing. I paused for a beat, then answered calmly, "It's my money. Is there a problem with me locking my own cards?" My response must have caught him off guard. The line went silent for a few seconds, as if he never expected me to be so direct. In the past, whenever there was a money issue in the house, I was usually the one to back down first. I might have been upset, even furious, but I would always choose my words carefully, always yield for the sake of peace. Perhaps that's why Mark and his whole family had grown accustomed to a wife who would soften after a few gentle words or a mild scolding. But not that night. I was in no mood to coddle anyone, and I had no interest in explaining the obvious. Mark's tone shifted faster than I expected. He dropped the harshness, his voice softening, but it was laced with impatience. Things are a mess here at home. With all these relatives around, what you did is like pouring gasoline on a fire. I let out a dry laugh, looking out at the dark yard. Let me ask you one thing, I said. Who invited them to stay? Silence again, the kind of silence that comes not from not hearing, but from not knowing what to say. The question was too simple, too direct, and it hit the nail on the head. I didn't wait for him to find an answer. When they showed up with their suitcases, did anyone ask for my opinion? When your mother stood in the middle of the living room promising to cover everything, did anyone look at me? Now that things have gone wrong, you're telling me I have a responsibility? Mark sighed, his voice rising in frustration. Do you have to be like that? They're family. They're struggling to find work. So they're just leaning on us for a few days. I cut him off. Leaning on us for a few days is one thing. Planning to stay for the long haul, bringing their own bedding, and treating someone else's house like a free hotel is another. I didn't raise my voice, but each word was so clear that even I could feel the coldness in my tone. Mark seemed to have truly lost his patience. You always make everything about money. It's just for a little while. What's the big deal? Hearing that, I felt more amused than angry. I asked him again, very slowly. A little while? Then tell me, how long is a little while? 3 days? A week? Or until they find jobs and decide to stay longer because it saves them rent money? Tell me. He didn't answer right away. I could hear a jumble of noises in the background, someone shouting a question, a chair scraping, a door opening and closing. The chaos filtering through the phone was enough to paint a picture of a house stretched to its breaking point. I tightened my grip on the phone. If they want to stay, they can pay their own way. They're all adults. If you move to the city to find work, you have to plan for rent, food, and transportation. No one has the right to push all of that onto me. This time, Mark didn't argue. He just lowered his voice. You know how Mom is. Everyone is looking at her right now. What you did makes her lose face. At that, I laughed out loud, but there was no joy in it. Lose face? I repeated. When your mother took my credit card and gave it to other people to go shopping, did anyone think about whether I was losing face? When I was standing in the middle of my own living room being told I was stingy over a few dollars, did anyone see that I was being disrespected? Silence on the other end again. I knew Mark understood. He understood everything. He was just used to staying in the safe zone, used to being silent and letting me handle it. So when I finally stopped carrying the burden, he saw how quickly everything fell apart. I was about to say more when I heard a faint scuffling sound, and then my mother-in-law's voice cut in, sharp and piercing. Give me that. A second later, her voice slammed into my ear through the speaker. What you're doing is a complete disrespect to this family. I paused. Not out of surprise, but because I knew this was coming. For my mother-in-law, the problem was never what she did. The problem was always when someone else dared to defy her. That was disrespectful, unreasonable, and ungrateful. I listened as she continued to shout, You're making a scene over a few credit cards, letting all the relatives see. Do you want to humiliate this entire family? Is that what you want? Her voice grew louder, as if shouting would make her right. I sat up straighter. The tea in front of me was now cold. My parents were inside, and they could probably hear me, but they didn't come out. They knew I needed to end this on my own terms. I held the phone a little tighter and spoke slowly, not loudly, not rushed. Disrespect? This family has never respected me. The other end of the line went completely silent. No more shouting, no more interruptions, just a brief, Heavy silence, where I could hear my own breathing. I didn't say anything else. That one sentence was enough. Enough for Mark to understand, enough for my mother-in-law to understand, and enough for me. For so long, I had tried to believe that if I just endured a little more, was a little softer, a little more accommodating, everything would be fine. But that night, I realized that with people who take your sacrifices for granted, the more you give, the more they demand, the more they believe you are obligated to provide. And once it reaches that point, all explanations are futile. Finally, there was a sound on the other end. It seemed my mother-in-law was about to say something else, but I didn't wait. I hung up. The dark screen reflected my faint image in the night. I put the phone down on the table and exhaled slowly. It was the first time I had ever spoken to them so directly. It was also the first time I felt no lingering guilt, only a clear, certain feeling. I had crossed a threshold, a point of no return. I was no longer willing to be the talking ATM in that house. After I hung up, I knew there would be no peace on the other side. Some words, once spoken, don't just anger the listener. They force them to confront a truth they have been trying to ignore. My statement that night this family has never respected me must have felt like a direct slap in the face to my mother-in-law, delivered while she was surrounded by the very relatives she was trying to impress. I wasn't there to see it, but I could imagine the heavy atmosphere in that living room after the call. My mother-in-law probably handed the phone back to Mark, her face dark with rage. Mark likely stood there, stunned for a moment, not expecting my resolve. The brief silence after a tense confrontation is often more unsettling than shouting, because everyone understands that things have moved beyond a childish tantrum. The relatives, scattered around the living room on the mattresses and chairs, would have been watching, waiting for a clear answer. They had come to the city with the assurance of a safety net, someone to take care of them. Now that it was suddenly gone, they all felt like the ground had vanished from under their feet. The initial excitement from when they first arrived had likely evaporated. After a moment, someone would have broken the silence. And true to their nature, they would have been practical. Perhaps an older uncle or a cousin sighed and said, "Well, for now, maybe we should all chip in a little for food. Just sitting here, staring at each other won't solve anything." On the surface, that sounds reasonable. But it really just showed they were beginning to understand that freeloading in my house wasn't as easy as they had thought. Everyone wants a free place to sleep, but when it comes time to open their own wallets, the so-called family bond starts to fray. But not everyone would have been willing to contribute. Someone, surely, would have grumbled. A young cousin might have complained, "But Aunt Brenda, you said we could stay here and not worry about money." Another would have added, "That's right. We left our town because we heard we'd have support here. Now, just a few days in, you're asking us to chip in? How are we supposed to manage?" These complaints, though framed as laments, were actually accusations. They were blaming my mother-in-law for overpromising, for making commitments she couldn't keep, for painting a rosy picture that crumbled at the first sign of trouble. My mother-in-law loves to be in control, to be the one whose words are final. So, the more her relatives whispered and complained, the more she would lose face. And for her, while money might be tight, her pride was something she would fight to protect at all costs. I can almost see her sitting up straight in her chair, her lips pressed into a thin line, trying to maintain a strong front while her insides were in turmoil. Every comment from the relatives would have felt like a scratch on the pride that had already started to peel away when the cards were declined. Unwilling to admit she was wrong, she would have turned to blame the easiest, closest target, Mark. I can hear her voice, a mix of anger and restraint. "Can't you control your own wife? You let her cause a scene like this?" That line is so familiar, it's almost comical. After all, her unilateral decisions, her promises, her invitations, it all came back to Mark failing to control his wife. In her mind, I wasn't a person with the right to her own finances. I was something her son was supposed to manage, to keep in line. But this time, Mark couldn't just stay silent. For days, he had been pressured by his mother, watched by his relatives, had no money, and was shut down by me. That pressure, piled onto someone who typically avoids conflict, was bound to overflow. He probably snapped back, "Mom, don't put this all on me. Who was the one who promised this whole crowd a place to stay? Who was the one who said you'd cover everything?" Just one sentence like that would have been enough to make the tense room even more strained. My mother-in-law certainly couldn't stand being challenged by her own son in front of everyone. She would have raised her voice. "I did it for this family. Are we supposed to kick our relatives out onto the street when they're in trouble?" Mark, already on edge, might have let out a dry laugh. "Help should be within your means. What were you planning to use to support them?" It was all Sarah's money, remember? That would have been the real blow, because it exposed the one thing she hated most. Her generosity was largely funded by me. The argument between mother and son likely erupted right there in the living room, in front of everyone. Not a private disagreement behind closed doors, but a full-blown fight. One trying to save face, the other pushed to the brink. The relatives sitting around them would have initially tried to intervene, but would have quickly fallen silent, just listening. They all knew this mess was no longer about where dinner was coming from. Then, in the middle of the suffocating atmosphere, someone would have made a half-joking comment, the kind that hurts the most. Maybe a cousin, leaning back in his chair, forced a smile and said, "Maybe you should just call the daughter-in-law and apologize. If you want peace, you're going to have to be the one to back down." As soon as he said it, I'm sure the room went quiet for a beat, because everyone knew it was true. But the truer it was, the more humiliating it was for my mother-in-law. Brenda had spent her life being the one in charge, the one who scolded others, never the one to ask for anything. To tell her to call me and apologize, in front of the very relatives she had boasted to, was like forcing her to admit she was wrong, that she had made empty promises, that her grand gestures were all based on her daughter-in-law's money. Just the thought of it would have made her face flush with rage. Not just at me, but at the situation that was forcing her to bow down to the very person she thought she could control forever. And it was from that moment on that I knew the cracks in that house were real. No longer small fissures that could be covered up with a few casual remarks about family, but deep fractures running through pride, money, and the false order my mother-in-law had struggled for so long to maintain. That night, after the tense argument in the living room, the house finally grew quiet. But I knew that silence was not peace. It was just the brief lull before something more insidious began to form. For someone like my mother-in-law, when cornered and humiliated, she doesn't just get angry and move on. She schemes. She finds a way to regain the control that is slipping from her grasp. I wasn't there, but knowing Brenda's personality, I could practically predict her next move. It must have been after the relatives were all asleep, when the only sound in the living room was the whir of the fan and the restless shifting of bodies, that she quietly called Mark into her room. "That tone, come in here. I need to talk to you," was one I had heard countless times during my years as her daughter-in-law. It always meant she was about to say something she didn't want others to hear, or plot something not entirely honest. I can picture the room, lit only by a dim, yellow nightlight. My mother-in-law sitting on the edge of the bed, her back straight, her face still swollen with anger. Mark standing or sitting on a nearby chair, exhausted after a day of being hounded by relatives, blamed by his mother, and rejected by me. The air in the room must have been so thick that the first words spoken would release a torrent of frustration. And, true to Brenda's nature, the first thing she said would not have been self-reproach, but a full-blown attack on me. I can almost hear her voice, raspy and filled with the bitterness of someone whose pride has been wounded. "Who does your wife think she is, to dare to do this?" It sounded like a question, but it was really a bitter accusation. She wasn't shocked that the cards were locked. She was shocked that the person who dared to do it was me. In her mind, I was supposed to be the one who yielded, who listened, who could be pushed around but never push back. So, for me to cut off the money supply, and then speak so bluntly to her on the phone was, to her, like being slapped in public. Mark, too, must have been pushed to his limit that day. He wasn't the type of man to take charge or resolve conflicts, but being caught between his mother, his relatives, and me, had finally made him crack. I suspect he blurted out the easiest, most desperate thought that many men have when they lose control of a situation. Maybe we should just get a divorce and be done with it. For him, it was probably just a way to vent, a way to push this chaotic mess as far away from himself as possible. But for my mother-in-law, that was never the solution. Brenda would have reacted instantly. Without a moment's hesitation, she would have shaken her head, her voice sharp and cold. If you divorce her, who's going to support this family? That was her most honest statement in days. It wasn't about relatives, or honor, or morals. It was a raw, unfiltered admission that she did not want to lose the source of income she had come to rely on. She might not have called me a walking ATM, but her thinking wasn't far from it. To her, divorce wasn't about her son's marriage falling apart. It was about losing the person who paid the bills, losing the ability to play the generous matriarch with someone else's money. Hearing that, Mark probably fell silent for a few seconds, because, in his own pragmatic way, he knew his mother was right. For years, the vast majority of the household expenses had come from me. He knew how smoothly the house ran, how his mother could maintain her image with relatives, and how he himself could live a relatively stress-free life, all thanks in large part to my income and my tolerance. So, saying get a divorce was easy, but facing the consequences was something neither he nor his mother wanted to do. It was likely in that silence that my mother-in-law changed her strategy. She's the type of person who, when she can't win with brute force, finds another way. If being soft doesn't work, she gets tough. If being tough doesn't work, she brings in more people, more pressure, more talk of honor to corner her opponent. I imagine she lowered her voice, but that's when she's most dangerous, because it means she's plotting. She would have spoken to Mark, her words slow and deliberate. We have to make her come back. And when she comes back, she has to turn the money back on. We can't let this go on, Mark might have asked, his voice weary. How? She's at her parents' house. She won't listen. And my mother-in-law, with all her experience and bitterness, would have likely gritted her teeth and replied, she has to listen. We'll use the relatives to pressure her. Use the family's honor to corner her. She's still a daughter-in-law, still your wife. She can't just walk away that easily. It's a classic tactic of people who believe that by turning a private matter into a family affair, by using the weight of the group, by leveraging social shame, any woman will eventually yield. I know that tactic all too well. The family pressure they use isn't about finding out who is right or wrong. It's about breaking the will of the person in the weaker position. They wouldn't ask why I left. They would focus on how I had embarrassed the family, ruined the reunion, and made them a laughingstock. They would twist the narrative until I, the one who was pushed to the brink, became the one at fault, all because I dared to stop providing what they had grown to expect. And the ridiculous thing is, my mother-in-law still believed that trick would work. Mark, after a moment of silence, probably nodded, not because he fully agreed, but because he couldn't think of another way. A man accustomed to avoiding conflict will often cling to the easiest solution presented to him, even if he knows it's not right. He likely sighed and said quietly, I'll call her again tomorrow. That was enough to reassure my mother-in-law, because she thought she had pulled her son back to her side. But there was one thing both of them didn't know, or perhaps refused to believe. I had anticipated almost all of their reactions from the moment I locked those 5 cards that morning. I knew my mother-in-law wouldn't give up easily. I knew Mark would waver, get angry, consider divorce, and then retreat because of his own self-interest. I also knew they would try to pull me back, not with respect, but with pressure, with relatives, with the so-called honor of the family. Because I knew all this, I wasn't rushed, wasn't panicked, and had no regrets. I sat at my parents' house that night, looking at my now quieter phone, and felt an unusual sense of peace. Because I understood that locking the cards was just the first move. What truly panicked them wasn't the 5 pieces of plastic, but the fact that, for the first time, I was no longer following the script they had written for me. And once I stepped out of the role of the one who takes care of everything, this story was only just beginning. The next morning, I woke up earlier than usual. I had slept better at my parents' house than I had in weeks. There were no sounds of shuffling slippers in the living room, no chaotic comings and goings, and no feeling of waking up and immediately having to worry about what the household needed or who had taken a card. My mom was up early making oatmeal, and my dad was on the porch with his coffee. The quiet atmosphere was soothing, but I knew it wouldn't last. With my mother-in-law's personality, she wouldn't let things rest after I had cut her off so completely. Sure enough, around mid-morning, just as I finished helping my mom with the breakfast dishes, we heard the sound of cars screeching to a halt outside, followed by a cacophony of voices. Not one car, but several. I froze. I didn't even need to look to know who it was. My mom gave me a worried glance, and my dad put his coffee mug down, his expression hardening. In the front yard, there was the sound of hurried footsteps and the metallic screech of the front gate being shoved open. They didn't arrive like visitors. They arrived like a posse coming to collect a debt, or more accurately, to reclaim what they thought was still theirs. By the time I stepped onto the porch, my mother-in-law, Mark, and several of the relatives were already crowding the yard. Every one of them had a grim, angry look on their face. Some were craning their necks as they came through the gate, as if to make sure the neighbors were watching. My mother-in-law was dressed in dark clothes, her hair pulled back tightly, her lips a thin line of fury. Mark stood beside her, dark circles under his eyes from lack of sleep. But his exhaustion didn't soften him. It made him look colder than ever. Behind them stood the same relatives who had been laughing and eating in my home just days ago, now assembled like a tribunal on my parents' lawn. The moment she was through the gate, my mother-in-law's voice shot out, sharp and loud, without a greeting, without any regard for whose house this was or who was present. She pointed a finger straight at me, her voice echoing through the quiet neighborhood. "You run away from home over a little disagreement? What kind of wife are you?" As soon as she said it, I saw curtains twitch in the houses next door. In a quiet suburban neighborhood, a raised voice in the front yard is everyone's business. My mother-in-law knew that, and she was doing it on purpose. She wanted to turn this into a public spectacle to shame me, to force me to back down. Before I could say anything, a relative behind her chimed in, her voice dripping with sarcasm. "Who would want a daughter-in-law who behaves like this? Running back to mommy and daddy over a small family issue. People will laugh." Another woman standing next to her sneered, glancing at my parents. "Once a girl is married, she belongs to her husband's family. You can't just pack a suitcase and come back here like you're single." Each sentence was like a stone thrown directly at us. They hadn't come to talk or to resolve anything. They had come to pressure me, to overwhelm me, to use their numbers to corner me into surrendering. Mark stood there the whole time, making no move to quiet his mother or his relatives. Only after they had all had their say did he look at me, his voice cold. "You've taken this too far, Sarah. Unlock the cards and come home so we can talk about this properly." Hearing him say "talk about this properly" almost made me laugh. If he really wanted to be proper, he wouldn't have brought a mob to my parents' front yard. If he really wanted to be proper, he would have told his mother from the beginning that she couldn't let her entire extended family move in, and she certainly couldn't use my money to support them and act like it was her right. I looked straight at Mark. It was the first time since I'd left that I had looked at him for so long without a single pang of sympathy. My question was short and clear. Properly? Is properly inviting nearly 10 people to live for free in my house, using my money to support them for a month? My words hit a nerve. The crowd behind him shifted uncomfortably, and a few faces fell. My mother-in-law immediately snapped, pointing her finger at me again. "Your house? You're a married woman now. You're supposed to take care of your husband's family. Stop saying my house. My money." She spoke so fast she was almost out of breath, but her words revealed the mindset she had long held. Once I married her son, everything I owned automatically became theirs. I didn't argue with her. I knew that with people like her, arguing in public would only make her louder. I just stood straight, looked at each face crowded in the yard, and then stated my terms, slowly and clearly enough for everyone to hear. "Fine, I'll come back. On 4 conditions. 1. All of your relatives move out of my house. 2. You return all 5 authorized user cards. 3. From now on, all household expenses will be transparent and budgeted. No one touches my personal accounts. And 4. No one is allowed to enter my private room or touch my personal belongings without my permission. As soon as I finished, the air grew still. They probably didn't expect me to confront them head-on, let alone lay down conditions in front of everyone. Then, a female cousin standing near Mark let out a sharp, derisive laugh. "You really think you're the owner of the house, don't you?" The moment she said it, a murmur of agreement went through the others. To them, the fact that I dared to set conditions was an unacceptable act of defiance. I turned to my mother-in-law, no longer feeling anger, just a profound coldness. I said my final words, not loudly, but with enough force to silence the entire yard. "I am not coming back to support a group of people who treat my home like a free motel." This time, no one interrupted, no one laughed, because that statement left no room for interpretation. I had exposed exactly what they were doing, in broad daylight, in front of my parents and the neighbors who were now openly watching from their porches. And I knew, from that moment on, this was no longer a story about a daughter-in-law throwing a tantrum, as my mother-in-law had wanted to paint it. It had become a real confrontation, one where I had no intention of backing down. Being called out so directly in my parents' front yard, in front of the neighbors, my mother-in-law's face turned a shade of purple. The aggressive demeanor she arrived with seemed to evaporate, as if doused with cold water. She stood frozen for a few seconds, her lips pressed tight, her eyes wide with fury, unable to form a coherent retort. The relatives with her lost their bluster as well. Some turned away, others muttered under their breath, and a few started inching toward the gate, as if afraid of further embarrassment. Finally, my mother-in-law managed to grit out one last threat. "You just wait." With that, she spun around and stormed off, the whole group trailing behind her. I watched them go from the porch, feeling no sense of victory, only a clear understanding. From now on, they would stop with the direct confrontations. They would start playing a different game, one that was quieter and dirtier. That evening, just as I had predicted, the frantic phone calls stopped, replaced by something far more insidious. A barrage of messages flooded the family group chat on my husband's side. I rarely participated in that group, usually just reading to be polite. But that night, message after message popped up, each one chilling me to the bone. Someone wrote, "How can you expect to have a good life when you're so selfish?" Another added, "As soon as they get a little money, they start looking down on family. It's true what they say about new money." Someone else wrote a long paragraph about how I, as a daughter-in-law, was hoarding my money and leaving my husband's family stranded in the city, that I had no humanity. The way they phrased it, you would think I had committed a terrible crime and they were the innocent, abandoned victims. I sat there, watching the messages scroll by. In the past, I might have felt hurt, might have wanted to explain that it wasn't about refusing to help, but about refusing to let others treat my generosity as an obligation. But after everything that had happened, I had no desire to explain anymore. To people who have already decided you are the villain, anything you say will be twisted to fit their narrative. I didn't reply. I just silently took screenshots of the entire conversation, saving each message in a dedicated folder on my phone. It didn't stop there. Around 9 o'clock, a young cousin on my husband's side posted a vague but clearly targeted status on social media. Some women get married, and all they can think about is hoarding money for their own family. Underneath the post, other relatives chimed in. Some reacted with angry emojis. Others left comments like, "So ungrateful. People like that end up alone." It's true. Money really does blind people. I looked at it and found it almost funny. They talked as if I had stolen money from them, when they were the ones who had shown up uninvited to live off me, to use my money. And the moment I cut them off, they turned around and accused me of having no decency. I still said nothing. I just kept saving everything, the group chat messages, the social media posts, and even a short audio recording from that morning of my mother-in-law yelling in my parents' yard. I didn't know if I would ever need it, but I understood one thing very clearly. When dealing with people who love to cause trouble and then play the victim, you must keep the evidence. Not to win an argument, but so that, when the time comes, you can lay it all out and ask them directly who is really trying to smear whom. The next afternoon, while I was helping my mom in the garden, my phone rang. It was the security guard from my apartment building's front desk. He knew me well because I had lived there for a long time and was always polite. He'd occasionally call if a package arrived or if there was an issue. As soon as I answered, I heard the hesitation in his voice. "Ma'am? There's a lot of noise coming from your apartment today. They've been arguing loudly since this afternoon. The whole floor can hear it." I paused for a moment, then asked, "What's happening?" The guard lowered his voice. "Something about money for food. The people in your apartment keep going up and down. One young man was even banging on the door earlier. A little while ago, while one of them came down and asked me if there were any cheap rooms for rent nearby." Hearing that, I could picture the scene perfectly. The relatives were losing patience. In the first few days, they had been excited, thinking they had found the perfect setup. But with the cards locked, no cash on hand, and the meals growing meager, the so-called family bond was showing its true colors. A young cousin must have finally snapped, slamming his fist on the table and yelling, "You were so sweet when you invited us up here, telling us not to worry about a thing. Now you expect us to manage on our own in the city? How?" Another would have complained about how expensive everything was, how they couldn't possibly find a job without a stable place to stay. Every word would have been directed at my mother-in-law, but she would never admit fault. She could be out of money, humiliated, and cornered, but she would never admit she had made empty promises or that her generosity was built on my dime. So, she would have deflected, shifting all the blame onto me. I can almost hear her voice bitter and sharp. "It's all because of that disrespectful daughter-in-law. Otherwise, this house has plenty of money." It was a way to save face with her relatives and to lie to herself, as if my return would magically restore her to the role of the generous matriarch. But things were not that simple anymore. Mark, caught in the middle of all that pressure, was probably starting to get angry with his own mother. He likely snapped, "Mom, stop it. The important thing now is to get her to come back." On the surface, it sounds like he was trying to find a solution, but his words revealed the truth. For them, the issue wasn't about who was right or wrong. It was about how to get me back into my old role, to continue carrying the burden I had just set down. They didn't want to change their behavior or respect my boundaries. They just wanted me to come back so everything could return to the way it was, as if nothing had ever happened. And it was from that evening on that things began to escalate beyond what I had ever imagined. Because when they couldn't pressure me over the phone, couldn't shame me with relatives, and couldn't support themselves, they came up with a truly vile idea. They must have clung to the belief that somewhere in that house, I had left cash, or another card, or something that could help them hold on for a few more days. And so, they decided to go into my private bedroom and search through my belongings. It was no longer about freeloading. They had crossed a new line, directly violating my private space and property with the shameless conviction that they were justified in doing so. The next morning, I was in the kitchen with my mom when my phone buzzed softly. It was a familiar notification, not a call or a text, but an alert from the security camera I had installed in my bedroom at my own house months ago. At first, I thought it was just a random motion alert, maybe Mark going in to get something. But as soon as I opened the app, my hand froze. The vegetables I was holding fell from my grasp. On my phone screen, my bedroom was in clear view. The wooden wardrobe in the corner was wide open. My mother-in-law was standing right in front of it, her face tense, her eyes darting through each shelf. 2 relatives flanked her. One was bent over, pulling open the drawers of my vanity. The other had thrown open the suitcase I kept at the foot of my bed, turning my clothes inside out as if searching for a needle in a haystack. The feeling of watching strangers violate my most private space. My bedroom was so chilling I could feel my own heart clench. I held my breath and kept watching, A young cousin picked up one of my designer handbags, turning it over in her hands, her eyes lighting up as she muttered, "This would probably sell for a lot." Her words sent a cold shock down my spine. This wasn't speculation anymore. They were actually considering selling my belongings for cash. In their minds, all boundaries had been erased the moment they decided I had cornered them. What was even more chilling was my mother-in-law's reaction. She didn't yell at them, didn't stop them, didn't say a single word about leaving my things alone. Instead, she spoke in a dry, cold voice that was terrifying. "Look for credit cards and bank statements first." Her words left me stunned for a few seconds. In her mind, I wasn't just a disobedient daughter-in-law who needed to be brought back in line. I was a vault of money she felt entitled to break into whenever she wanted. She had gone too far, so far that she no longer recognized the line she had crossed. I didn't call and scream. I didn't text and demand an explanation. In moments like this, anger only makes you lose your composure. And with people this shameless, a few harsh words would change nothing. I closed the camera feed for a moment, took a deep breath, and then reopened it to save screenshots and video clips. I captured every face, every action, and my mother-in-law's damning words. At that point, I no longer felt hurt. I just saw things with absolute clarity. They had just cornered themselves with no way out. I stood up, walked out onto the porch, and made my first call to the building's management. I told them briefly that people were going through my belongings in my apartment, that I was on my way back, and that I might need their assistance if things escalated. After that, I called a friend who is a lawyer. She listened for less than a minute before asking, "Do you have it on camera?" "I have everything," I replied. She paused, then said concisely, "Don't give them any warning. Just go straight there. If they try to deny it, play the video for them on the spot." My last call was to my older brother. I didn't go into detail. I just said, "I need you to come with me to my place. They're going through my things in my room." He didn't ask any more questions, just replied, "Stay there. I'll be there in 10 minutes. An hour later, I was standing in the lobby of my building. I hadn't said much on the way over. My brother sat beside me, his face a cold mask, and my lawyer friend was with us. No one asked if I was sure, because the evidence on my phone was undeniable. As we stepped into the elevator, my hands were ice cold, but my mind was clearer than ever. I knew that the moment I opened that apartment door, this story would enter a new chapter. It would no longer be about family arguments, cold wars, or gossip. It would be a direct confrontation with the ugly truth that my husband's family now saw violating my property as a justifiable act. The moment the apartment door opened, the noise from inside hit us. The living room was still filled with the sounds of people arguing about money. A man was yelling about gas money for job hunting. A woman was complaining that there wasn't enough cash for groceries that morning. The TV was on low in the corner, but no one was watching. The whole apartment felt like a pressure cooker about to explode. I stepped inside first. The living room went silent almost instantly. My mother-in-law was standing by the dining table. She froze when she saw me. The two relatives in the hallway also stopped in their tracks, their faces paling. Mark, who had been sitting on the sofa, shot to his feet, looking both surprised and flustered. No one had expected me to return so soon, and certainly not at the exact moment when they hadn't had time to cover their tracks. My mother-in-law was the first to react. She opened her mouth, probably to let out one of her usual tirades to regain control. But I didn't give her the chance. I walked straight to the coffee table in the middle of the room, placed my phone on it, and played the video I had recorded less than 2 hours earlier. The image of my bedroom filled the screen. The footage showed her standing in front of my wardrobe, the two relatives rummaging through my drawers and suitcase. Her voice, clear as day, echoed through the now silent room. "Look for credit cards and bank statements first." For a few seconds, no one spoke. I could see the color drain from their faces. The cousin who had posted vague insults online now stood rigid, her eyes fixed on the phone as if she couldn't believe her actions had been recorded. A man near the door abruptly turned away, pretending to look at something else. Mark stood as if he'd been struck by lightning, his lips pressed into a thin line, his face ashen. And my mother-in-law, for the first time since I had married her son, was utterly speechless. Finally, one of the relatives stammered, his voice weak and trembling. We were just looking for some cash to get by." The excuse was so pathetic I almost laughed. Get by? As if they had accidentally borrowed a spoon or a shirt, when in reality they were ransacking my bedroom for bank documents and private property. I looked at each of them, my voice level but colder than I had ever heard it, from freeloading to ransacking my room and attempting to steal my property. "You are no longer guests here." The moment I said it, I knew everything had changed. From that point on, they could no longer hide behind the word family to justify their actions in my home. The living room was dead silent after my words. The silence was so heavy you could hear the ceiling fan whirring overhead, but my mother-in-law, true to form, was not ready to give up. Her face was pale, but after a few seconds, she forced herself to recover, jutting her chin out, her voice raspy with anger. "Everything in this house belongs to the family. Anyone can touch it." Her words were so absurd I almost laughed. Even now, she was clinging to the archaic belief that if she just claimed ownership, everything would magically become hers, her son's, the family's. I didn't argue with her. I walked over to my handbag on the chair, opened it, and pulled out a file I had prepared long ago. It was full of documents I had quietly kept over the years. Living in that house, I had always known a day might come when I would have to protect myself. I placed the file on the coffee table in front of everyone. The motion was not aggressive, but it was firm enough to startle them. I opened it to the first page and spoke slowly, enunciating each word so no one could pretend not to hear. "The purchase agreement for this condo is in my name, dated before our wedding. The furniture, the renovations, the appliances, and the majority of the household expenses all paid for from my personal bank account." As I spoke, I flipped through the pages. The deed, the bank statements showing the wire transfers, the receipts for the furniture, the invoices from the contractors. Each document had a date, an amount, and the name of the person who paid. The room was stunned into silence. The atmosphere, which had been a chaotic mix of defiance and anger, was now thick with a suffocating tension. Mark stood there, his eyes glued to the papers on the table. Looking at his face, I felt a strange sense of distance. Not because he didn't know I had paid for the house, but because this was likely the first time he was forced to see it all laid out in black and white, not filtered through his mother's dismissive claims of our money, or what's yours is ours. I turned to look directly at my husband, my voice even but cold. "You can stay here because you are my husband, but these people cannot, and if you choose to side with them, you can leave with them." The words made Mark flinch. His lips moved as if to say something, but nothing came out. He probably never imagined a day where I would put everything on the table like this, no tears, no begging, and no comfortable middle ground for him to hide in. My mother-in-law was no longer shouting. She stared at the papers, then at me, her eyes blinking rapidly, as if trying to process something she refused to believe. "Finally," she stammered, Are you threatening me?" Her voice was weak and bitter, the last gasp of someone who had run out of arguments but was desperately clinging to a shred of dignity. I didn't answer her. I just pushed the phone across the table toward her. The screen was still paused on the video of them ransacking my room, along with a list I had quickly made of items that had been moved. Next to it, I had the screenshots of the family group chat, the social media posts, and the audio recording of them shouting at my parents' house. I looked straight at my mother-in-law, my voice firm. "I'm not threatening you. I'm giving you one last chance before I call the police for trespassing and attempted theft." Hearing the word police, several of the relatives' faces changed completely. The aggressive confidence they had when they arrived from out of town, when they criticized me, when they rummaged through my room, it all vanished. A man who had been standing defiantly by the door suddenly turned on my mother-in-law, his voice rising in anger. "You told us this was your son's house." That was the spark that lit the fuse. Immediately, another person added, "That's right. You said we could stay here as long as we wanted, that your son would take care of everything. A young cousin chimed in, her face red with fury. We believed you, Aunt Brenda. So it turns out this was all her money from the very beginning? The tables turned so fast it was almost comical. A stark display of the cheapness of their family bond. Just yesterday, they were all united in calling me selfish and ungrateful, showing up at my parents' house to harass me. Now, the moment their own interests were threatened, they immediately threw my mother-in-law under the bus. No one defended her. No one mentioned family loyalty. One by one, they accused her of lying, of boasting, of luring them to the city with false promises. My mother-in-law sank into a chair, the blood draining from her face. She opened her mouth to argue, but caught between the undeniable proof in front of her and the angry accusations of her own relatives, she had no ground left to stand on. Mark stood frozen, his hands clenching and unclenching, unable to defend anyone. He knew things had gone too far, that they could no longer be smoothed over with a casual, we're all family. I had no desire to spend another minute in that suffocating room. I pointed to the door, my voice more decisive than I had ever heard it. You have 2 hours to pack your things. Take everything you brought with you. If a single one of my belongings is missing, I will press charges. The room fell silent once more. No one dared to laugh, to argue, or to test me again, because this time, my words were backed by papers, by videos, by undeniable proof. They finally understood that if they pushed me any further, I would not stop at simply kicking them out. Exactly 2 hours later, the hallway outside my apartment was cluttered with suitcases, pillows, duffel bags, and the miscellaneous boxes my husband's relatives had brought. The scene was as chaotic as the day they had first arrived, with one key difference. There was no cheerful laughter, only the sound of rolling suitcases, heavy sighs, and the grim, resentful faces of people who had been defeated. At first, a few of them tried to play the victim. One stood in the hallway, lamenting loudly, "It's almost dark. Where are we supposed to go?" Another tried to appeal to sympathy. "Do you really have to throw us out on the street like this?" I just felt tired. If they had come with decency, with a polite request for help, things would never have reached this point. But they had chosen to treat my home as a free hotel and my money as their personal fund. And now that they were caught, they wanted to play the role of the pitiful victims. But I was all out of sympathy. When the building manager appeared in the hallway, flanked by my brother and my lawyer friend, the complaining immediately subsided. People only learn their limits when they realize they are no longer dealing with a silent, submissive daughter-in-law. No one dared to cause a scene or try to force their way back in. They just quietly gathered their belongings, their faces dark with anger, occasionally shooting resentful glares at each other. And in that moment, the family bond that my mother-in-law had so proudly flaunted began to shatter. A young cousin, struggling with a large suitcase, suddenly let it drop with a loud thud, her voice choked with anger. "We only left our homes and came all the way here because you made it sound so certain." Her words were loud and clear, devoid of any respect, filled only with blame and bitterness. Immediately, an older man, unable to contain himself, turned on my mother-in-law and yelled, "You live on a $1,200 Social Security check and act like you're rich. What kind of promise of room and board was that?" The hallway went quiet for a beat. Some things, when hidden behind a veil of pride and bold promises, can make a person seem powerful. But when they are exposed by your own family in a public place, the humiliation is unbearable. My mother-in-law stood frozen, her face ashen, her lips trembling as she tried to form words that wouldn't come. She turned and grabbed Mark's arm, her voice cracking. "Say something, son." It was the first time I had ever seen her without her commanding, domineering air. All that was left was a woman who had lost her footing among the very people she had tried to use to boost her own ego. But Mark couldn't say anything. He stared at the mountain of luggage, at the relatives dragging their belongings away, and then he looked at me with an unreadable expression, a mix of anger, helplessness, and shock, as if he was only just now realizing how completely out of control things had become. I felt no satisfaction seeing him like that. I only felt weary. Weary that, after everything, the man I had married had chosen silence until it was too late. I took my spare set of keys off my keychain, walked over to the table, and placed them in front of Mark. The sound of the keys hitting the wood was small but distinct. I looked at him and spoke slowly, without anger or blame. From now on, you either move out and get your own place, where you learn to live as a responsible adult who respects boundaries and finances, or you go with your mother. I am not supporting anyone else. I didn't need to say more. I didn't want to turn this into a victory lap. Some boundaries, when trampled on too many times, have to be rebuilt with your own two hands. Hearing this, my mother-in-law's last bit of pride seemed to ignite. She lunged forward, her mouth open to scream a final curse, but I looked her straight in the eye and said, my voice calm, almost devoid of emotion, "You love your pride. You love playing the generous benefactor with other people's money. From now on, you can do it with your own $1,200 a month." My voice wasn't loud, but perhaps because it was so calm, the words cut deeper. My mother-in-law crumpled into a nearby chair. She collapsed into it, her hands gripping the armrests, her face white, her eyes staring into nothing. I don't know what was going through her mind. Humiliation, shock, or perhaps, for the very first time, the understanding that the things she had always taken for granted had never truly been hers. No one rushed to her side. Her relatives had already turned their backs on her, and Mark stood frozen like a statue. And me, after all the pain I had endured, I suddenly felt a strange emptiness. I turned and walked toward the elevator. Behind me, the chaos continued, the arguing, the complaining, my mother-in-law's ragged breathing, someone hastily dragging a suitcase away. The sounds blended into a cacophony, but this time, I didn't look back. Not because I was heartless, or because I felt like I had won, but because I finally understood that if you are always the soft one, people will see you as a place they can lean on, take from, and hurt without consequence. As the elevator doors closed, I saw my faint reflection in the cool, stainless steel. The anger from the past few days was gone. All that was left was a single, clear thought. This time, I hadn't just locked 5 credit cards. I had locked the gate on their right to treat me as a walking wallet, a resource to be drained at their convenience. And, perhaps late, but not too late, I had finally reclaimed for myself the peace I once thought I could only keep through silence and submission.